quick content warning for descriptions of death and murder, and later descriptions of crimes committed against people. Therefore they rushed at him and laid their sacrilegious hands on him, roughly manhandling and dragging him, intending to kill him outside the church or carry him away in chains, as they later admitted. Since he could not be easily moved from the pillar, one of them attached himself and applied himself particularly fiercely. The archbishop pushed him away, calling him a pimp, and said, "Do not touch me, Reginald, you who by right owe me fealty and obedience. You and your accomplices are acting like fools." But the knight was inflamed with terrible fury at this rebuff, and brandishing his sword against the consecrated crown, said, "I do not owe you fealty or obedience against fidelity to my lord king." The invincible martyr, seeing then that the hour was at hand when the miseries of mortal life would be ended, and that the crown of immortality prepared for him and promised to him by the Lord was now within reach, bent his head in the manner of prayer, joined his hands together, and lifted them up, and commended his cause and that of the Church to God, Saint Mary, and the blessed martyr Denis. Hardly had he said the words than the evil knight, fearing that he would be snatched by the people and escape alive, suddenly leapt on him and wounded God's sacrificial lamb in the head, cutting off the top of the crown with the oil of holy chrism had dedicated of God. The same blow almost cut off the arm of this witness, who as everyone fled, monks and clerics, steadfastly stood by the bishop, and held him in his arms until his arm was struck. Behold the simplicity of the dove, behold the wisdom of the serpent in this martyr, who offered his body to the persecutors, so that he preserve unharmed his head, that is, his soul, and the church, nor did he devise a defense or trap against the killers of the flesh. O worthy shepherd, who let sheep be torn to pieces, so bravely presented themselves to the jaws of the wolves. Because he had abandoned the world wishing to crush him unconsciously raised him up. Then he received another blow in the head, but still remained immovable. But at the third blow he bent his knees and elbows, offering himself as a living sacrifice, saying in a low voice, "For the name of Jesus and the well-being of the church, I am prepared to embrace death." But as he lay prostrate, the third knight inflicted a grave wound. With this blow the sword was dashed on the pavement, and the crown, which was large, was separated from the head, so that the blood white from the brain, and the brain equally red from the blood, brightened the floor with the colors of the lily and the rose, the Virgin and the Mother, and the life and death of the confessor and martyr. The fourth knight warded off those arriving on the scene, so that others could carry out their murder more freely and wantonly. But the fifth, not a knight, but a clerk who had come in with the knights, so that a fifth stroke was not lacking to the martyr, who in other things imitated Christ, put a foot on the neck of the holy priest and precious martyr, and, horrible to say, scattered the brains with his blood over the pavement. "Let us go, knights," he called out to the others. "This fellow will not get up again." What I have just read to you is the account of the martyrdom of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29th, 1170, by Edward Grimm, who was the witness. It was a witness of the murder, and he was the witness whose arm was injured by blocking the blow of the first knight, or receiving the blow of the first knight as the sword slashed down. This was a heinous act. It was a despicable act in the eyes of medieval Christianity. It was condemned by any figure you think of medieval Christianity, by the Pope, by the King of France, by the Holy Roman Emperor. All of these people condemned this act, and it was written about for many reasons. But some context on who Thomas Becket was. So Thomas Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the appointed official in charge of the church in England at the time. He was over the other Archbishop in England, who was the Archbishop of York. He was honestly the supreme Archbishop of the entire British Isles, but the Scottish Church tended to contest that. He had been appointed by Henry II about 8 years earlier, under different pretenses. He had been the Chancellor of Henry II for most of his from 1154 to 1162 when he was made the Archbishop. They had been considered the best of friends, and a quote of that from one of his letters was that there are no greater friends in history, and no two of more of the same mind. These were two men who worked extremely well together and who knew each other intimately. So what caused some wanton words from Henry at a Christmas feast in 1170 to have a bishop butchered in his own cathedral? In 1162, Becket was made the Archbishop of Canterbury by Henry. He turned, effectively, on his friend. He went from being a listener, a pompous, somewhat arrogant, and full of himself and knowing his power, to wanting to prove that he was just as good at being an archbishop as he had been at being the chancellor, as he had been in his life. He had come from a low background. He was the son of an English merchant, of a merchant in London. And he had risen to the highest office in the land available to a church official, other than the papacy. So he went on a tirade and fought an 8-year legal battle with Henry II over the rights of churchmen in England. His whole purpose was to get the entirety of the papacy on board that what Henry wanted to do to the church was offensive in the eyes of God. And he did this in controversial ways, including getting himself exiled to the court of the King of France. Because of all of this, Becket is a very controversial figure in the history of the medieval church, in the history of England. He made Henry II a controversial figure, even though he kind of already was. So all of this goes into hagiography, what is being written about. And that's what we'll get to next. So what is hagiography, you might ask? Hagiography is any writing, typically a saint's life, it was a biography, and the miracles of a saint. They relate to how the saint earned their sainthood, and typically were used as trying to prove sainthood. So the process for becoming a saint is thus. You would have a hagiography written about you, which recorded your miracles and your life and your deeds, and it would be presented to a council of church officials helmed by the Pope and the rest of the papal cura, who would then hear testimonies of your miracles by eyewitnesses who said that they've seen this happen it happened at your tomb or happened at any other point, which helped edify you as a servant of Christ and placed you in relation to Christ. Hagiography is written with the express purpose of arguing that a member of society was worthy of being consecrated and canonized as a saint. Hagiographies tended to be written after, as in the lead up to this, they tended to be written after a person had died. Sometimes, especially in the 12th century when Becket dies, they were written when people were still alive. And they were really important for determining why someone should be a saint. They're important for teaching people good actions, good deeds. And they were also important for arguing against the detractors and critics of a saint and saying, why did this person become a saint? And what good deeds did they do? It's an interesting part of hagiography is that the way modern people conceive history, and when you think about history in modern time, you don't really think of everything in this leads up to this point, and there's a divine plan that wraps up all of these points. Everything happens for a reason is not really accepted anymore as kind of a truth. In hagiography, every single action, every single deed, all of the visions and beliefs that are held by the writer are leading up to the death or the deed that makes a saint a saint. For Thomas Becket, he's a martyr. Every moment in his life was leading up to his death, was an imitation of Christ's life and passion. That's why there's 5 members that go and kill Becket. There's the 4 knights and the clerk. They are trying to say that his death is the same, his 5 wounds were equivalent to the 5 wounds that Christ received on the cross and in death. The reason for hagiography really depends on when it was written. Becket's is very interesting because Becket's hagiographies were written after his death. Well, obviously after his death. They were written after his canonization. Becket was canonized extremely quickly in 1173 when most of his biographies, only 2 of his hagiographies had been written. So he was canonized extremely quickly. And let's get into why that's so interesting. Quick correction from last slide. Becket was canonized on 21st of February 1173, not 1172. Moving on. The canonization of Becket is interesting, as I said, because only 2 of his biographies had been written at the time that he was canonized. This was a Becket by one of his close confidants, John of Salisbury, who wrote a biography from 1171 to 1172, and by Edward Grimm himself, who wrote a biography from 1171 to 1172 as well. No other biography had been completed by the time that Becket became a saint. So if you're thinking, based on the criteria and the process for becoming a saint, why would he have other biographies? Well, Becket is an interesting case where he has over 10 large and substantial biographies that were written for him after his canonization. And all of these were hagiographies. They were talking about his deeds and his miracles. They were the miracles associated with his tomb, I should say. And they were really focused on the rhetoric of why he should be a saint. The reason for this is it is because of the controversial figure that Becket was. Becket incited a fight between the church and the king over who has control and who's able to where clergy should be prosecuted in the medieval court. Effectively, how it worked was the medieval court system. If you were a cleric or connected to the clergy at all, that does not mean you were a priest. You didn't have to be endowed with the proper materials. You didn't have to be ordained. If you were connected with the clergy, if you could prove that you were a member of the clergy, you could be tried in a church court, and therefore you would receive lesser punishments for greater crimes. This is just content warning real quick. People were murderers, rapists, hurt people, robbers, embezzlement. All of these crimes that churchmen would complete, and they would not be charged as a lay person would be for these crimes because the church couldn't prescribe the death penalty. It couldn't harm the people who committed these crimes. And that was one of the main things that the king was in charge of. So Henry II Becket fought over whether who should be in charge of charging these people. The king himself, obviously, and Becket was like, no, the church is separate from the king because the church only answers to God. Effectively, Becket got a lot of critics because of the hardline stance he took and because of the conflict he caused with Henry II. One of his critics even went so far to say that he was a traitor to the church and a traitor to his people because he tried to defend the church's ideals by attacking the people who gave the church its power, namely the kings and the royals. He made the church weaker by trying to strengthen it. His cause failed and didn't last past his death. His cause was worthless, and yet he died for nothing. So, a lot of the hagiographers, about 8 of them were contemporaries of Becket or had known him in his life. Another 3 or 4 were not contemporaries of Becket, had never met him, had never interacted with him, and were not witnesses to his death. But all of these people felt compelled to write about Becket and to argue that even though this man, this controversial figure who went toe-to-toe with the king and was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral, he was a saint because he had done all of these deeds in his life that ended up to his martyrdom. His martyrdom was the greatest moment of his life. His death was what made him pure. His death was successful. His death was what made them, in their eyes, the greatest saint of the medieval Christendom. He was higher than the church fathers. He was higher than any saint had been before him because of his death and because he was standing toe-to-toe to a king. Becket is an extremely interesting figure, and how hagiography argues for Becket is fascinating in its breadth and in what the biographers are trying to say. I hope you've gained some information about who Becket was and why hagiography is important to understanding why a political figure who died horribly but was controversial, would be shown as a saint and a holy man on the levels of St. Paul and St. Peter themselves. Thank you.